Hi everyone, today I'm going to address the question of what is cost-benefit analysis. So if you've been to my website, you'll probably notice that a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that I've done in the past has related to cost-benefit analysis. So with this video I'm going to explain to you exactly what I mean and what is meant by cost-benefit analysis. Okay, simply put by Campbell and Brown in 2003 in their textbook, social cost-benefit analysis is a process of identifying, measuring and comparing the social benefits and costs of an investment project or program. It's a very simple, very concise definition. But today I'm going to go into a little bit more detail than what's just expressed within that definition. So where does it all start? You've got to have a problem. In order to do a cost-benefit analysis, you're offering a solution to a problem and you're analysing that solution. So the first part is actually identifying that problem. Normally the analysts don't identify the problem by themselves anyway, but they get a bit of help before they get involved. So normally a problem would have been identified, and the job of the economist is actually to look into what that problem means and also some of the potential solutions. So a bigger part of the problem is actually defining the base case. So what exactly is the base case? The base case is the world without the project. And it's not just the world as it is, it's also the world going forward if the project did not exist. So in many cases we see a world that is often portrayed as completely out of control, an Armageddon. But in reality though, most likely that's not going to happen. Normally some sort of decisions have been made to mitigate some of the problems that have been identified. And sometimes human beings, we just react to that problem ourselves without any initiatives going forward. So the key to a good base case is to be realistic. Again, that's very difficult because you could be looking at an analysis where we're projecting about 30 years into the future. And going that far into the future is sometimes very, very difficult to know exactly what's happening. But again, we've got to try and make our best estimates regards to what that's going to be. So once we've established what our base case is, we need to have a number of options. Bear in mind the base case is the yardstick that you're actually going to be comparing your options against. So it's good to have a range of options, some of them being rather large capital spends, some of them, often the most effective solutions are in fact those ones that are more around the simple solutions, sometimes often around demand management solutions that often are not particularly expensive. And they also tend to perform fairly well in a cost-benefit analysis since the costs are normally kept fairly low. But again, it's good to have quite a range of options. And also as well, sometimes a problem has more than one solution. So you may end up with actually 3 or 4 potential solutions to that problem, and they actually form a program that's being used to address the problem rather than an individual project. Next step is, now that we've established what the world is like without the project and what it's like now, we've come up with a number of options. So now we've got to look at the costs and the benefits of those options. So first off, we've got to define them. What are the benefits of a project? What are the costs? Some of the costs are going to be straightforward. You're going to have your capital costs. You're going to have your maintenance costs. Some of the other costs are going to be a little bit more difficult to understand. Some of them may be negative externalities of people that you may not even think are affected by the project. And of course, if you've got a good project, you should have benefits. And those benefits ideally should be greater than your costs. So again, what are those benefits and how do we go about identifying them? There's existing literature in some cases. That's particularly true for transport projects. But in other cases, we don't have that existing literature. So sometimes we have to go out there and actually find out what those benefits might be. And normally stakeholder engagement is a good way of doing that. And again, you could have a very wide group of stakeholders. So again, it can be quite tricky, and you can use those stakeholders to identify other stakeholders. It's always good to go to the community, people who are actually on the ground, people that are very familiar with the problems, and they can help you also define the base case, as well as help you identify what are the potential benefits of an upgrade, and also what are the potential costs that that may not have been considered or thought about. So what's next? So we now have established our base case, we've got our projects, and hopefully at this point we'd have established what our costs and benefits are going to be. So we need to come up with a methodology. a way of actually being able to put a value on those benefits and costs. Some of them are going to be simple. They're going to be in dollar values. Again, like your capital costs, going to be in dollar values. Maintenance is going to be in dollar values. What about in terms of, time saved? What about in terms of lives lost? How are we going to get values for those? There may be guidance on some of that. Again, the transport industry is a very good example of where we have the ATAP guidelines, and that actually provides quite a lot of information in terms of how you determine values for your identified benefits. And it goes in a lot of detail. Other sectors, maybe health and education, don't have the benefit of those guidelines. So again, it's going to require a little bit more out-of-the-box kind of thinking. And again, when you come up with a methodology, you need to know exactly what you need to get things to work. So what we need to look at next are the data requirements of the project. So you have a methodology that should basically outline your approach to the analysis, and to support that approach, you're going to need to collect data. Sometimes the data is going to be fairly readily available. You're going to have guidelines, you're going to have data sets, you're going to have databases in which you can actually acquire that data. Sometimes it's not so easy. Sometimes you've actually got to go out and investigate. You've got to engage in surveys. It could be contingent valuation, and maybe even reveal preference in terms of how do people behave under certain circumstances. And the data collection can sometimes be very, very time consuming. So again, you've got to analyze what are the requirements of the project, what are your time frames, what are your budget. You may come to the conclusion that some of this data is just a little bit too difficult to obtain, and then you've got to look at it in terms of more of a qualitative description of this. And also remember, you've got to state the limitations in any cost-benefit analysis where you feel that potentially that there are benefits and costs that are not getting monetized simply because of a lack of data. So the next step, once we've looked at the data, is to actually go back and revisit your methodology. You may not be able to do things exactly how you initially planned, and once you've investigated, once you've tried to acquire the data, maybe you've approached some modelers that are saying, well, we can't quite get you what you want and within the time that you wanted. So again, you've got to revisit your methodology, and you've got to come up with some assumptions to actually fill in the gaps where you may have some holes in your methodology. So again, this could be quite a bit of a process. So even with assumptions, they can't be just like completely, out of nowhere. You need to have some supporting evidence. And sometimes it's good to relate to maybe some of your previous projects and establish rules of thumb around certain parameters or certain values you're going to include in your analysis. So again, whatever you put in there needs to be supported by sources, even if it's an assumption. And again, it's got to be logical, and then once you've completed it, it's got to then stand up to scrutiny of a peer review. Okay, so now that we've established our methodology, hopefully we've got our data, or the data's on the way anyway. We can confirm what kind of data we're going to have. The next step is to actually calculate your costs and your benefits. So again, there should be some guidance around what formulas and what algorithms that you need in order to calculate it. Some of them are going to be reasonably simple, some of them can be very complex. An example of a complex one is if you're doing a transport project, you need to calculate your vehicle operating costs. And there's so many different aspects to vehicle operating costs. There's your fuel, there's your oil, there's your tires, there's repair and maintenance and all of that stuff. And there's a whole list of, it's probably like about 50 different formulas that are required to actually calculate what your overall vehicle operating costs are. So it can be very difficult if you're starting from scratch. And sometimes it's a lot easier if you actually have a model. So again, you may have a pre-built model from some of the other cost-benefit analysis you've done in the past, or sometimes you've got to start from scratch, or sometimes you have a model but it needs a bit of modification. And I've always been preferred to use models rather than actually rely on just going back to scratch and just working directly through spreadsheets. So again, it has to be something you can actually calculate your costs and your benefits with. Alright, so what do we do now? Assuming that we've got a methodology, we've applied that to the data, and we've now actually calculated both our costs and our benefits. So the next step comes is the comparison of costs versus benefits. For a cost-benefit analysis, for a project or options to be considered economically viable, your benefits need to outweigh your costs. And there's a few ways of expressing that. You can write it as a ratio, which is your benefit-cost ratio, benefits divided by costs. And you're looking for a ratio of above 1, that will tell you that your project is economically viable. Another thing you can look at is your net present value. So if your benefits are greater than your costs, then you should get a number that's greater than 0. Again, I'll be covering this a little bit later. All costs and benefits are required to be discounted. So what is a discount rate? I'll explain that a little bit later at the end. But again, it's when you're looking at 30 years from now, you can't just use the actual values, because there's an opportunity cost of actually applying the capital to the project instead of to an alternative use. Okay, so once you've now got your results, maybe your net present value, your benefit cost ratio, you need to go back and investigate some of your assumptions. There's going to be certain assumptions that you're not going to be as confident about as others. And with those assumptions, it's actually good to apply a sensitivity to that, apply a sensitivity analysis. Like, for example, you have your demand. How does your demand fit in? Let's say we've used a medium scenario. What happens if there's a low scenario? What happens if there's a high scenario? Does that have a real impact on your results? You can play around with other things, like again, how does behavior change? Is your project going to come in there? Is it going to completely change people's behavior? And to what extent as well? Normally, if something doesn't change behavior in any way, it generally doesn't really generate too many benefits. If it has a massive change in behavior, again, it also may not produce that many benefits, because your capacity is getting crowded out by this extra demand. And that's what we'll be talking about a little bit later as well, is induced demand. So again, with your sensitivity analysis, you could be applying percentages, or you could be just looking at several different scenarios and how you apply that. And a good way of doing it as well, which can get a little bit complicated, is the application of Monte Carlo analysis. So again, you'd be assigning probabilities to certain scenarios, and then you'd be calculating that and generating a distribution of results. It could be distribution of benefits, costs, net present value, and your benefit cost ratio. So generally, you'd be looking at reporting our results at what we call a P50 value, which is actually your median value. So again, 50% of the time you expect the results to be higher, 50% of the time you expect them to be lower. Again, it's also worth including what we call a P90. So that gives us 90% confidence that our results are not going to fall below a particular value. And that's actually quite valuable to include in your sensitivity analysis. So what do we do next? So now that we have the results of our projects, we've got to look at it in terms of the program. Normally, projects will be part of a program, and you need a certain way, you need to rank those projects within the program. So how do you go about doing that? The benefit cost ratio, or possibly your net benefit investment ratio, is actually a good measure to actually rank projects within a program. So again, you'd be looking at, say you've got a fixed budget for a program, which is quite possible. So it's potentially maybe your top 6 benefit cost ratios may land in that project. Again, it could be a bit of switching around if some of your projects don't sufficiently monetize some of your benefits. But actually to rank by benefit cost ratio is actually very useful. And then once your funding is exhausted, and then you draw a line there. So maybe you evaluated, let's say 12 projects, and once you've reached 8 projects, the ones below that then just get cut off, or potentially go into another program later on. Which means you could have a cut-off benefit cost ratio that could very well be above 1. It could be 2.6 or maybe 3 or something like that, if all of your projects are actually generating very high benefits. Again, there's the potential to actually maybe get more funding for your program if you realize that, wow, some of these projects are actually really generating a lot of benefits and actually fairly critical. Again, as well, you've got to bear in mind the relationships between some of your projects as well. You may have a project by itself, may not generate a very high benefit cost ratio, but if you extract that out of your program, there's the potential of actually lowering the results of some of your other projects within that program. So again, it's important to understand the interrelationship between your projects within the program when you do your ranking. So it may not be just a simple rank by BCR. It really depends on your program and the relationships of the projects within that program. So at the end of all of this, what would you expect? So you've got a consultant in to do your cost-benefit analysis. They should produce a cost-benefit analysis report. They'll probably produce some spreadsheets, a model that's been created, that's been populated, and they'll probably submit that to you. So again, all the stuff that we discussed just now, you've got to clearly define your base case, clearly define the options, the methodology and assumptions that have been applied, and you also have to clearly articulate the results and what those results mean. And again, whatever's been put in your report needs to clearly sourced. It needs to be very well sourced so it can actually be verified. And again, it's very useful to actually have the model supporting that as well. So these are the things you need to look for when you receive your cost-benefit analysis report. Okay, so that just summarizes what a cost-benefit analysis is and what goes into it. I'm now going to cover off very quickly on some of the key concepts. So possibly the most important concept in a cost-benefit analysis is actually transparency. What is transparency? Basically, everything that goes into your analysis, it needs to be very clearly documented and needs to be well sourced. That again is important for peer review, so when someone has a look at it, or even if it goes out as a report to the general public, people can look at that and they can understand exactly what's going on and exactly how those numbers were made. For ideal transparency, you really want to have a report and possibly backed up by a model where you can actually duplicate what has actually been done in the cost-benefit analysis and obtain the same results. If you're looking at a report and you're thinking, well, I don't know where this come from, I can't calculate that, then you may have a transparency issue. Another key point is consistency. Again, if you're working within a program, your projects need to be consistent with each other. You need to have a consistent approach to the demand you're using. You need to have a consistent approach to the way the modeling's been conducted. So again, that's quite important, but at the same time, there has to be a level of fit for purpose too. So you can't just have the exact same assumption for every single project. So again, it's a bit of a balancing act. Another key point is the reference group. This is actually very important, and this is often defined very, very early on. Often not necessarily by the analysts themselves, but actually by the project teams, because they'll be able to tell you who is actually going to be affected most by this project and how far out it goes. You know, you're going to have your direct users, there are going to be plenty of indirect users as well. So it's quite important to determine your reference group, and also it's important to determine as well as if you go too far abroad, then too far ahead, you'd be looking at some potentially people impacted, but it's very hard to put a value on that, and it could be quite insignificant to the analysis. Assumptions, we talked about that earlier. Again, all assumptions need to be backed up by evidence, and assumptions are good at filling the gaps when you don't have the data. Demand and supply. Demand and supply is fairly critical, because demand and supply is a really key driving force behind any cost-benefit analysis. So really, if you look at your supply, that's looking at the infrastructure that you may be putting in place. And if you're expanding it, you're increasing the supply. And the demand is your users. So normally when your demand is high, your supply can meet that demand. You create a service need, and often that there's a requirement for a project or for investment. Again, it's demand, you've got to look as well as you're projecting forward as well, and growth rates, all of that go into demand. So if you've got a high demand with a lack of supply, generally if you've got a project that addresses that, it's probably going to come up with a fairly good result. So consumer surplus, again this is important in the sense that that could actually induce demand, which is actually the next point I'm going to talk about, is that the fact that you've now improved services. So now someone, like for example, you put in a train line, someone maybe just staying at home is now deciding to actually go out and go to different places they wouldn't have done before, simply because you have that new infrastructure in place. So that links in induced demand. Discount rate, this is another important concept. I mentioned it earlier, but all of your benefits need to be discounted. So you have a normally predetermined discount rate. So if you're looking at Infrastructure Australia, for example, they have discount rates of 4%, 7% and 10%. And the discount rate is essential in a sense that you're accounting for the opportunity costs of... So if you're putting money into an investment, that money could go elsewhere and be doing alternatives. So you've got to wait for a return on that. So everything therefore is discounted by that lost opportunity, should we say. So again, it's how you value things in terms of time. So you're getting your return is coming back maybe 15, 20 years, for example. That's where your discount rate is going to hit very high, instead of actually having the money on you right now for alternative use. Externalities. Externalities is a very key point, because we often look at the direct users and the direct beneficiaries of a project, but externalities in a sense is looking at those outside of that. So for example, if you're building a new motorway, that's going to produce noise, and that is going to be a cost to those people living within the area. So they're actually receiving a negative externality out of that investment. Next, we're going to look at our important measures: benefit cost ratio, net present value, internal rate of return, and incremental benefit cost ratio. As explained earlier, benefit cost ratio is simply your benefits divided by a cost. Net present value is your benefits minus your costs. Internal rate of return, This is basically this is your discount rate for where your project breaks even. So for example, when your benefits equal to your costs. So for example, you may require, let's say, a discount rate of 12% in order for your benefits to equal costs. So that, in a sense, it's good in the way because that looks at it in terms of return. We don't use it that much in cost-benefit analysis. It's probably more for financial evaluation. And possibly one of the most key indicators is actually incremental benefit-cost ratio. I didn't mention this earlier, but this is actually a very important ratio because that's comparing between your different options. So, for example, you may have, let's say, a $20 million option and you may have a $25 million option. So you're going to spend an extra $5 million on that second option. And then you have a look at the benefits. Are the benefits higher than the benefits of the $20 million option? And if they are, let's say, for example, your $20 million option has $30 million of benefits. Your $25 million option has $32 million of benefits. You've got $2 million of extra benefits, but those benefits are going to cost you an extra $5 million. So in a sense, the costs outweigh the benefits in terms of the increment. So 32 over 25 million, it gives you a benefit cost ratio greater than 1, but that's not going to be the optimal option because those additional benefits don't outweigh the costs. So the incremental benefit cost ratio in this case would be 0.4. Okay, that takes us to the end of this presentation. I'd like to thank you for listening in, and again I'm going to be uploading a few more videos in the weeks and months to come. Again, a lot of them is going to be focused on economics, so if you like this presentation, click the like button, and if you're interested in listening to a few more presentations, a few more videos in the future, then you can hit the subscribe button. Thank you very much.